What's going on, everybody? You've got Evan Knowles and Logan Jones here with the Middle Tech Podcast. This was a really fun, very insightful episode, one of the more insightful episodes for the blockchain, NFT, crypto, Bitcoin space we've done yet. The reason is because we sat down with one of the leading researchers / attorneys within the space. He is the Spears Gilbert Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky. So he speaks regularly on this subject, both in research papers and to his students. The key here is that he actually is an artist. His origins are an artist. So he went and did film studies at UC Berkeley and philosophy, and then he did the fine arts at University of San Francisco Art Institute. So he's got a background that is perfect for NFTs. You know, he went from fine art to becoming an attorney, and then now he's a professor within the space. And so he's somebody that a lot of people turn to on this subject. And so we really dove into his perspective on the whole space, which is very unique and timely.
Yeah, I think this is a really encouraging episode for just knowing that our students, at least at the UK College of Law, are being exposed to these really new and emerging trends around the NFT space, around the blockchain space. And this episode actually came to us through a student at the University of Kentucky Law School, one of our close friends, Joseph Provancic, after taking his classes and hearing a lot about what this episode talks about. And you know, at the end of this episode, after we had recorded all this and he'd given all these insights, I kind of declared this was one of my favorite episodes that we've done around NFTs and blockchain, just because normally we're talking to people that have immersed themselves in the space, but very rarely are we talking to people that have a very technical background, a very in-depth background in a space that the blockchain and NFT space is going to cause ripples in. So because he has such an extensive background in the legal field, in legal studies, also in art, it's a really interesting intersection, and it just gives him a lot of experience in the relevant fields that this new technology is going to be affecting. So definitely one of these conversations that's just very, very in depth, but one of my favorite interviews that we've done on all of these different types of topics. So excited for you guys to take a listen.
Yeah, we talked all about intellectual property, blockchain, and how that affects the intellectual property space and attorneys and what that means for attorneys going forward. And then we spent a good amount of time on NFTs and the art space. He loves talking about that. He talks about it regularly. So we talked about some of the big cases happening in that space, what it means for NFTs in relation to IP, and how artists are protecting themselves and finding new ways to monetize and get distribution within their given art field. For instance, music or film. You know, we talked about Quentin Tarantino. We talked about, for instance, Kanye West and one of his personal friends that released music, and the innovations that's happening with blockchain and releasing art directly to an audience. It's really fascinating stuff, and he knows all about it. So you guys should enjoy this episode. It's one of my favorite as well. Let's get into it. But before we do, let's get a word from our sponsors.
Middle Tech is presented by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's entrepreneurship and innovation partner. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to work alongside an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you're a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information at kyinnovation.com.
We are also sponsored by Bolt Marketing. As a business owner, you're forced to wear multiple hats, but you should be focused on growing your business while you let somebody else handle your marketing. Our friends over at Bolt offer a full suite of services from websites to branding that will help you transform your marketing and grow your business. To learn more about how Bolt can help you with your business goals, you can check them out at buildwithbolt.com. Again, that's buildwithbolt.com.
Our next sponsor is the Johnson Law Group and Brandon Johnson. Brandon represents my startup, and I've had great experience with him and works with companies from inception to billion-dollar valuations. Whether you are trying to formalize a side hustle or bring new technology to market, the Johnson Law Group is willing to help by offering a free 30-minute consult. Schedule yours today at thejohnsonlawgroup.com and tell him that we sent you.
All right, we're here with Professor Brian Frye, who is the Spears Gilbert Professor of Law at the UK College of Law. And we were just talking about that title and wondering what it meant.
Well, I'm not really sure. It's a university donor, and we have lots of named professorships at the College of Law, as with other colleges at the UK College, University of Kentucky. I personally felt like I needed a more dramatic and apropos title for myself.
What'd you come up with?
So I decided, you choose a title you want to have rather than the title you are already entitled to. So I went with the Dogecoin Professor of Law and Grifting in the hopes that Elon Musk will notice and decide to make one of his, many parodic gestures in the form of an endowed professorship in my name right here at the University of Kentucky.
Well, who knows? Maybe Elon's a Middle Tech listener. So Elon, if you're listening to this, please reach out to Brian.
We need more of that spirit in our universities.
Absolutely.
A little bit more fun.
Entrepreneurship, man. Entrepreneurship.
Yes, let's go.
Well, cool. So we're excited to dive into your background. We're going to be talking all about kind of the intersection of cryptocurrency and NFTs and intellectual property law, all of which you specialize in and even have your own podcast about, which we'll get to that as well to make sure that you can direct listeners where to go if they want to learn more about that. But just to start things off, give us a little bit of your background, where you're from, educational background, and then we'll lead that up into what you're into today.
Great. Okay. So I was born in San Francisco in 1974 and grew up mostly in the North Bay, Santa Rosa, Sonoma County area. So wine country, basically. I went to college at UC Berkeley, where I studied film studies and philosophy. And after graduating from my undergrad, I did a master's in fine arts at the San Francisco Art Institute, also in filmmaking. So I was kind of looking at a career as an artist. After that, I moved to New York City, where I did a little bit more school, but then decided I was kind of going to take some time to work on my own projects for a while. And so I was a film artist primarily, also writing a lot about film, doing film journalism, film history, film theory, and also presenting films kind of as a film curator, film programmer at different institutions around New York City, where I was an intern or someone who, worked as a programmer. Also at a micro cinema that I ran with a friend of myself. So we did weekly screenings in the Lower East Side for about 3 or 4 years. And then in 2002, I decided to change things up a little bit and went to law school, which was an interesting story. If you actually look at my name, Brian L. Frye, on the Washington Post, there's a kind of an interesting business page story about what kind of happened when I decided to go to law school in the first place. But long story short, I did my first year of law school at Georgetown and then transferred to NYU, where I got a JD. I then clerked for judges for a couple of years, first on the Washington State Supreme Court and then on the Ninth Circuit. I worked at Sullivan & Cromwell in New York City, so a big white shoe law firm, primarily representing banks and other financial institutions. I was on the litigation side. So I worked there for a couple of years and then left Sullivan & Cromwell to go into the academy. I taught as a non-tenure track professor, visiting assistant professor at Hofstra Law School for a couple of years, and then took a tenure track position at the University of Kentucky College of Law, where I've been for over a decade now.
So I want to ask a quick question here. Culturally, to go from film and art to being an attorney and being a professor in law, culturally, what kind of shock did you have, if any?
For me, it was a really natural progression. It was something I was excited about when I did it. I was looking for something new. It seemed like it would be an interesting career shift and a new kind of challenge. I think a lot of my friends from the film and art world were very surprised. A lot of them would say things like, "Oh, you had it made as an artist. Why did the career change now?" It's like I actually started law school the same year that I had work in the Whitney Biennial 2002. But, making it as an artist doesn't necessarily mean like what it would mean to make it in a lot of other careers. And I was, living hand to mouth and, a little I would say dissatisfied with a lot of the kind of professional opportunities available to me. And also realizing that in a lot of ways, if you prioritize having a job in a particular sector, when the reason you're interested in that sector is because it offers an avenue for creative expression, that the job is oftentimes a kind of not necessarily aligned with why you're interested in that area in the first place. And so, when I moved to New York, initially, a lot of what I did, like I think a lot of people was to say like, oh, I need to find a job working at like a museum or at a nonprofit or something like that. And then I realized that what I really liked was the doing part, and that I didn't need anyone's permission to do things. I could just do them on my own. And it's amazing what you can get away with if you don't ask for permission. You just kind of do it and let people wrap their heads around the choices that you've made. And I think that kind of in some ways led me to thinking about law school, that I just saw like, a lot of organizations I'd worked with had needed legal assistance, or people had legal questions. And I always found those really interesting and kind of intriguing. And I figured, why not see if this is a place where I can add some value and maybe have a job that would be fun and exciting, and also offer me the opportunity to sort of do things my own way.
As far as an intersection for talking about all the implications of NFTs and cryptocurrencies as it meets, is where rubber really meets the road, because it's so much of it is around ownership. And I just think that's a really interesting crossroads that you've come to with your background. So tell us a little bit about when you first discovered NFTs and kind of your initial thoughts on NFTs, and then maybe transition to that into how you view them today.
Or just blockchain in general, because blockchain and then NFTs kind of came from that.
Yeah, I think, it's better to start with the kind of the blockchain story, because I think the NFT marketplace is really an outgrowth of that and reflects a lot of the sort of background ethos and way of thinking about structuring legal relationships and ownership relationships that was instantiated by blockchain. So I first heard about blockchain, about cryptocurrency, a long time ago, right? When it started, right? I was working at Sullivan and Cromwell when the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper was released and Bitcoin was created, and people were talking about that in the financial industry, of course, because it was about currency and a new kind of interesting way of thinking about currency, and people didn't really know what to make of it, and I didn't know what to make of it, and I wasn't really a computer person, and I was like, that sounds strange and unusual, and I guess we'll see what happens. It seems kind of odd, but who knows? Maybe that'll go somewhere and maybe it won't. I regret not having taken it more seriously at the time, because if I had, I would probably hopefully be very wealthy today, which I'm not. But I knew about it very early on and kind of always kind of had an understanding of it in the background. And I would say the same is really true of NFTs. Because the concept of an NFT really came out of the art world, more than out of the kind of traditional crypto tech world. Digital art had been around for a long time. And a big problem with digital art was that it exists in a non-rival or kind of non-scarce kind of format. Every digital file is the same as any other digital file. So if you create a work of digital art, it was really difficult, if not impossible, to figure out what to do with that in the art market, right? Because how do you sell somebody a copy of a digital file when every copy of that digital file is identical? And you could conceptualize that kind of in terms of like selling conceptual art, like sell certificates or something like that, like real ownership, as opposed to just ownership of like a copy of something. But it never really took off. It didn't resonate with the art world as the kind of meaningful ownership that collectors really cared about. And so when Kevin McCoy kind of created the first kind of notional NFTs on the Namecoin blockchain in 2014, I actually even kind of vaguely heard about it then, because I knew Kevin a little bit through friends. We had a lot of connections with each other, and I kind of follow a lot of digital art related stuff. So I'd vaguely heard like, oh, people are doing these cool things where they're trying to, kind of create a record of art ownership on the blockchain, which would create a kind of scarcity analogous to the way scarcity works with catalog raisonné and so on in the traditional art market. And in fact, the second NFT that Kevin McCoy created was actually associated with a work of digital art that was created by a good friend of mine, Torsten Burns. So, I kind of feel like, again, it was kind of funny, like I knew about this stuff pretty early on, but I didn't really think that much about it. It was just sort of a fun kind of like project that was sort of conceptually interesting, but not necessarily something I was going to get directly involved in. I didn't personally get involved in cryptocurrency or NFTs. In fact, I didn't own or have any real knowledge, meaningful knowledge of how they worked until 2021, like a lot of other people. Essentially what happened was all of a sudden there were these really big sales, and it was clear that the art market was at least starting to kind of pay attention to NFTs. And that's what caught my attention. Because, for me, I'm interested in what markets are actually doing as opposed to, what they could kind of do in theory. And when something actually started happening, I thought to myself, well, maybe this is something I should be looking at. But what I found especially strange was when I looked at the NFT market, I was like, wow, this is literally a market in nothing, right? Like, the thing I realized right away was when you looked at what an NFT was, I mean, like in a kind of literal sense, you're buying nothing. You're buying an entry on a ledger that points to a URL on the internet, and that's it. It just stands for ownership, but it doesn't give you any exclusive rights necessarily. It could maybe theoretically, but it doesn't intrinsically give you any rights, and it doesn't kind of contain anything at all. And I was like, this is wonderful. It's like synchronizes so nicely with so much of my scholarship on sort of thinking about the nature of artwork and the financialization of artwork. And so I started creating my own NFTs as a way of kind of poking fun at sort of the nature of the market and conceptual art and how it works. So one thing that I've been doing in a project that I recently completed was a work of concept. I like to try to integrate my legal scholarship and my art practice. And so what I decided to do when I got tenure was to reconceptualize what it means to do legal scholarship and to think of legal scholarship as opposed to being a way of purely just expressing ideas about the law, to think of legal scholarship as a medium for conceptual art, a medium for artistic practice. And so I kind of kicked that off by creating a conceptual artwork in the form of a law review article, which I actually called the law review article a prospectus for the work of conceptual art, which was called SEC No Action Letter Request. So the work of art in question consisted of me sending a no action letter request to the SEC, asking the SEC to opine on whether the work of conceptual art that I was proposing to sell to the public in an edition of 100 for $10,000 a piece was or was not an unregistered security for the purpose of the Securities Act. And I explained in the paper to the SEC why it was in fact a security and why the SEC should tell me that I was not permitted to sell this particular work of conceptual art to the public, knowing kind of in advance the SEC was not going to take seriously / respond to what I was doing. They did not respond to my no action letter request. I did follow up with a FOIA request, which they refused to respond to as well. In any case, that kind of made a little bit of a splash. It showed up on Matt Levine, and people kind of talked a little bit about like, what is this? What's going on? Like, is this really a security? And the kind of the typical response was, well, no, because it's a joke and people don't really think it's for sale and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, well, that misses the point, but whatever. Anyway, circuitous way of saying the NFT market came along, and I was like, well, this is great, right? Because with the original work of conceptual art in the form of certificates, people were like, oh, there isn't a real market for this, so it isn't a real work of art, but a real security, or isn't something that's really for sale. Well, the NFT market is perfect, right? Because I can just turn this exact same work into an NFT, and then I'm selling it on a real market in a situation where people, at least theoretically, are really buying things, and isn't that funny? So I created an NFT of that work of conceptual art, put it up on OpenSea, and then almost immediately got a bid of like, 0.001 ETH or something. I was like, oh, that's great, whatever, I'll sell it. I don't care how much I sell it for. But then I was like, oh no, that's like basically no money, and the gas fees are way more expensive than the person else can pay me. I was like, well, I'm not going to pay money to sell somebody art. Forget it, that's pointless. I went to a different NFT platform that was free, Mintable, I think it was, and I created a bunch more kind of jokey NFTs. Like when I sold an NFT of the Brooklyn Bridge, I sold an NFT of the concept of the public domain. You name it. I kind of came up with a bunch of things. I was like, oh, this is funny. I'll kind of share them with my people on Twitter, and then I forgot about it for about 3 or 4 months. And then one day I got a DM from someone on Twitter saying, "Hey, I saw your NFT on OpenSea and I would like to buy it for 0.5 ETH." And I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And I look it up. I was like, "Oh my God, it's like $1,200, right?" I was like, "Absolutely. You can buy my nothing for $1,200. And I got to thinking, I was like, wait a minute, if somebody's interested in this, maybe they'll be interested in other stuff, and who knows? And I thought it really got me excited about kind of making more of these NFT things to kind of just see what happened. And so I made a whole collection of NFTs of these other works of conceptual art that I created, which were like little poems, like kind of like descriptions of like ways of doing legal scholarship that were intended to encourage people to think about what it means to engage intellectually with the scholarly enterprise and sort of what the incentives of scholars are and how this market for scholarship works. And I put those up there as kind of individual pieces. And lo and behold, they just like sold out almost immediately, right? And so then I did more, and I just started like engaging more in this market, realizing that, oh, wait a minute, here's a place in which people are interested in my kind of conceptual art projects and are interested in investing in those conceptual art projects in a, reasonably significant way. So, I've done several projects, and then I did at a certain point kind of transition more from doing NFT projects to thinking conceptually about what NFTs mean, how they work, and what, if anything, the NFT market can tell us about the future of cryptocurrency markets and maybe about the future of markets more generally.
Yeah, let's dig into that. So one of the places we wanted to start was, what are the implications of blockchain and NFTs for your now profession, for an attorney? How are attorneys, what's the reception within the industry to this right now?
It's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of resistance among attorneys because the law is a very slow moving profession. It doesn't like things that are new. It doesn't like things it doesn't fully understand, and it doesn't like things where there are concerns about certainty and concerns about certainty and unpredictability and so on. And I think all of those are true in spades when it comes to blockchain and to NFTs. I actually see a lot more kind of openness and uptake in the financial sector, where I think a lot of people in the financial sector see potential in
They see money.
They see money, they see, but I think they specifically see potential in things like smart contracts because they have more experience with kind of working with, in that format. And also in a lot of ways, it's analogous in some ways to like, intermediated settlement and so on. And so I think it's more obvious to people in the financial sector how this might have potential to make their businesses more efficient and more predictable and less risky in some respects if they get the technology right. I think the reality for the legal profession, as is so often the case, is that if the clients start using this technology and using it extensively, lawyers will figure out how to wrap their head around the technology that their clients need them to understand. And once they understand the technology better, if it turns out to be useful in the legal profession, which I think in many respects it potentially could, then I wouldn't be surprised if there's some uptake on the legal.
This is a question I ask. So there's a lot of application for blockchain, but there's some applications that just don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an application to replace, let's say, DocuSign documents with blockchain? Is that a legitimate application? Is that even a needed application, or does DocuSign do the job?
That's an interesting question. I don't really know the answer. And I think the question is, what do you think the job is, right? Like, how much certainty do you need, right? To what extent is DocuSign itself even really doing something that matters? And to what extent is it just a formality that is actually kind of meaningless? I think the more interesting applications are things that are already doing something very similar to what blockchain does, but in a kind of off-chain format. So things like title registries, for example, right? That for me is a really obvious area where there's potential for the technology to be really beneficial. I'm the last person to say like I predict XYZ. I don't predict anything, right? But I think, the way that NFTs are being used now suggests that other similar applications could also be potentially useful if certain kinds of kinks and bugs and risk factors get worked out, right? But the primary way, and this is interesting for someone like me who's kind of a scholar of the art market, right? The way NFTs are used now is very, very similar by design to the way that ownership and title works in the art market, right? I mean, the way I like to describe it is, look, in the art market, we think about art as being objects, paintings, sculptures, whatever, and it's just wrong. That's totally wrong. When it comes to the art market's perspective, that's the absolute backward way of thinking about it. If you're buying a work of art in the art market, by which I mean the actual investment speculative market as opposed to the tchotchke market of like decoration for your house, right? If you're buying into the real art market, what you're buying is an entry on an artist catalog raisonné, right? That's what you're really buying. You're buying slot number whatever on the catalog raisonné, and the painting or the sculpture that comes along with it, that's a token. Right.
That's interesting.
It's really just a dirty canvas or a lumpy rock, but it's valuable because it's associated with that entry on the catalog raisonné. If it turns out that it's for one reason or another deemed not to be associated with that entry on the catalog raisonné, say it's a forgery, say the artist disavows it, right? Say it gets damaged in such a way that it's no longer deemed to be kind of acceptable quality, then it can lose the value. But all of the value is derived exclusively from what that object is deemed to represent, not because of what the object itself is worth. The object itself is worth nothing in a market sense. It only has value in the meaningful market sense because of what it's associated with.
Because of the scarcity of the list.
Because of the scarcity of the entry on the list,
Yeah.
right? And an NFT is exactly the same thing. It just gets rid of the object. Right? Now all you need is the entry on the list, and the object doesn't matter anymore. The object is available everywhere, can't be damaged, can't be in theory, put on IPFS. If it gets deleted or lost somehow, that's a big, that could be a problem, right? But, the same is true with the painting, the same is true with the sculpture, right? If they get destroyed or whatever, that's a problem there too, right? But rather than needing to have the physical token to represent ownership, now it's just the digital token that represents ownership. Well, you can think of a title registry for homes or property the same way, right? I mean, the physical property is in a sense owned based on the entry in the title registry, right? And title registries are not great in a lot of ways. It's really hard to figure out who owns what. It's hard to keep track of them. If there's mistakes or problems or encumbrances, there's a lot of transactions costs associated with it. So, I mean, like if the technology develops in a way that people are comfortable with the risks, if any, or eliminate the risks associated with it, like the very real risks, like, what happens if somebody like, I steal your Bitcoin, like that's really bad if it's like the title registry for an entire county or something, right? But if those kinds of potential problems, those, hackers and bugs and all this kind of stuff can be eliminated, I see a lot of potential value there, right? Because that gets rid of all kinds of costs associated with maintaining those title registries and with getting information from them, right? Knowing who the owners are, knowing what kind of encumbrances there are on the property, knowing what the sort of transaction history has been, knowing how to find the person who owns this stuff. Like that could be a huge benefit. And it's pretty an obvious one, I mean, so, and I'm sure there's, potentially lots more stuff out there, right? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of room for innovation. I do think that there's a tendency for a lot of people to I think there's a tendency among kind of like blockchain Web3 evangelists to look at everything and be like, that's a use case, right? But there's also a tendency for, people who are like super hostile to blockchain and Web3 to be like looking to debunk all the time. And I guess, it's the latter that I find a little bit more tiresome. Right? Because I mean, I am the farthest thing from an evangelist, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, totally agnostic, right? A market that's developed is a market that it could very well be a bubble, and it could very well pop and be gone, next week, tomorrow, in a month. Who knows? I make no predictions whatsoever on that front, right? But what I have very little patience for is people who look at, a $40 billion market, or in the case of cryptocurrency, a multi-trillion dollar market, and then explain to me why it shouldn't exist in theory. And I'm like,
It does.
It does exist. And the fact that it does exist, I would propose is a real problem for your theory that says it shouldn't.
Yeah. But skepticism, say, from the side of financial well-being and protection, let's say SEC. So what's your take on regulation and, how we should be approaching this?
Mm-hmm.
Because, in a way, skepticism follows, wanting to protect oneself. So what kind of regulations are you seeing out there? Or what do you think should be taking place right now?
So I'm not opposed to regulation, but I am concerned about the SEC's approach to regulation of cryptocurrency in general, and, particular kinds of uses of cryptocurrency and NFTs in particular as well. Because I think this is a real existential moment for the SEC, right? They've existed, the agency has existed for 100 years. It's existed in a context where, broadly speaking, I think people felt that we had a pretty solid and rich and historically informed understanding of how capital markets work. And I think recent events have suggested that maybe the SEC doesn't necessarily understand how capital markets work quite as well as it thought it did. And maybe the SEC isn't entirely sure what its mandate is, right? I mean, is the SEC's mandate to ensure that there are truthful disclosures, or is the SEC's mandate investor protection, right? Those are not the same thing. And sometimes they can very much be in tension. I also think that to the extent the SEC is going to engage in regulatory behavior, it needs to understand the nature of the market that it's regulating. It needs to understand what that market values and why. And it needs to understand what, if anything, it can do in a regulatory framework that will improve the functionality of that market, right? I mean, the idea behind an agency like the SEC, at least on one level, is that it's supposed to solve market failures, right? It's supposed to make the market work better. In order to do that, it needs to understand how the market works. And I am not yet convinced that the SEC has a robust understanding of how these markets work. Worse, perhaps, I'm not yet convinced the SEC wants to have a robust understanding of how these markets work. And I think that's the problem. I think the SEC has shown a reluctance to engage in a constructive way with companies entering into this sector and trying to offer products that consumers are clearly interested in. And I think the SEC itself has created disincentives to companies to work with it, right? I mean, if you go to the SEC and say, I would like to offer this product, and this is what the product would look like, and this is how I'd like to do it, their response will be no. Every single time their answer will be, no, you can't do that, right? If you just do it, they may or may not stop you. And if you just do it and it turns out people want it, it's really hard for them to say, now you have to stop doing it now that you've already shown that there's considerable demand for it. That's a pretty strong incentive for companies to ignore the SEC, at least on the front end, and deal with them on the back end.
Well, that kind of happened with ICOs.
Absolutely it did.
They let that happen for a while, and a bunch of those turned out to be just scams.
Yeah, or a company like Tether, for example, though, right? I mean, plenty of other businesses went to the SEC and said, we'd like to offer stable coins or, dollar pegged products. And the SEC said no. Well, somebody else just did it. And there it is. Right. So, I mean, I just find that kind of disappointing. I think the SEC should do some introspection and ask what it's trying to accomplish. I think it should be more transparent with the industries it's regulating and listen more than talking, maybe like look for some input and talk more about what its regulatory goals are in the hope of getting input, from industry, but also from academics and other policymakers. And I just think the conversation should be more robust and richer and more collaborative, right? Whereas now I feel like there's a lot of posturing and not a whole lot of working together, which I think is unfortunate.
I think one of the things that attracts people to this space, though, is the fact that this concept of DeFi and decentralization is that even if the SEC wanted to step in, it's now off they're off their purview. If they wanted to step in and do something about Bitcoin, can they or can't they? What's your take on quote unquote DeFi? It's not truly DeFi because in order for somebody to enter that space, they have to interact with their bank, right, to get the money out of their bank. So it's like, is it true? Like, what's your take on this whole DeFi decentralization side of that argument?
I think anyone who is telling themselves that the government can't control what they're doing or can't punish them for doing what the government doesn't want them to is deluding themselves.
We've already seen examples. Examples of it.
I yell at friends about this all the time.
Yeah, we've seen them retrace stolen Bitcoin. We've seen them seize Bitcoin from criminals.
Absolutely, and it's not a problem at all. These are anytime that there's resources and money and people running a business, the government can go to the business and on pain of throwing people in prison, say, you need to give us this information. You need to show us the chain of custody. You need to show us like who has what money, and you need to identify who the people are who are associated with these particular wallets. And that's the reality of it. And I think it's ridiculous to think otherwise. And in fact, I think, the recent Bitcoin heist thing is a great example of that, right? I mean, like, I actually find it quite kind of amusing, but also pathetic to hear like people be like, say things like, oh, NFTs and cryptocurrency, it's all about money laundering. I'm like, what kind of moron would launder money
on a public
blockchain? Right? I mean, like, they'll say like, oh, look, these people are trying to launder all these billions of dollars in Bitcoin. That means Bitcoin is for money laundering. I'm like, no, they got caught immediately before they managed to launder much of anything. They didn't launder anything, right? Every single transaction, they got caught, right? It's because this is the worst imaginable medium for money laundering.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's a lot of other problems with it. Like I say, it's like, is it frothy? Is it a potential bubble? Are there all other are there lots of risks? Yes, all these things are true, but like, let's be honest about what the real problem is. The real problem is not money laundering. The real problem is not Ponzi scheming. The real problem is that maybe it's just not a great medium. The real problem is maybe it's just a bubble. Those are real problems, but like, using these kind of silly like analogies to totally unrelated kinds of scams and whatnot. This makes no sense to me at all.
Yeah, the last thing I want to talk about just real quick on, the whole cryptocurrency space and that worries me is like, if Bitcoin was like the chosen one, then the Lightning Network wouldn't need to be a thing, in my opinion. It just seems like, well, if we've got all these different transactions and, the blockchain is, it's definitely a utility that has a ton of value in other spaces. If the Lightning Network needs to exist and sit on top of blockchain, then what ultimate utility does it provide the everyday consumer?
Yeah.
I don't know if you spend much time in Bitcoin space and can comment on that, but that's one of the confusions to me with Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin the real thing here, or is the Lightning Network that sits on top of it given the utility?
Yeah, I don't really know the technologies as deeply as you do, but my general thinking is that like, this is a technology that spans a lot of different companies and a lot of different platforms and a lot of different protocols working in different ways. And I think it's premature to say what ultimately the kind of ideal format is going to look like and what the market really wants. And I think that this for me is like kind of an important kind of big picture way of looking at it, right? Because again, there's a real common thing that people will say is like, well, you keep talking about the Web3 blockchain, new technology. It doesn't do anything that you couldn't do any other way, right? I'm like, well, sure, if you describe it in a particular way, it's like, making entries on a database ledger, and you could do that on paper, you could do it on a computer, you can do it on an Excel spreadsheet, whatever, right? The point is that it didn't happen, right? That the market came into existence in response to something that changed in the kind of social technology, social relationships, technological developments that came along with this. I don't know exactly what caused that to happen. I'm sure maybe some people have a better idea than I do, but I think that it's unclear at this point. And it's really hard to predict what markets are going to react to and what technologies are going to end up being kind of catalytic in those markets, and why they're going to be catalytic in that way. And I think you kind of just have to let the market play that out and kind of through an evolutionary process, identify what it is that it really wants in order to function correctly. I mean, if you told someone, 5 years ago, people are going to be, spending and transacting, billions and billions of dollars in NFTs, I mean, I think any sensible person would have looked at you and thought you were nuts, right? But it turned out that apparently there was a demand for this that people hadn't anticipated. And I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting as a social phenomenon, and it's worth studying just because it's happening. And the fact that it happened tells us that there was an unmet market demand of some kind, right? That this was satisfying. I'm not convinced we necessarily know what it is yet, but there's something there.
Yeah. And one of my questions is like, as even people like us who might be on the cutting edge, or at least be watching really closely what's going on, try to grapple with these questions and answer these questions, you've still got these government and regulatory agencies, and then things like the court of law that are trying to make these decisions. And they might be a few steps behind all this stuff. So are you paying attention to any of the maybe trials or legal proceedings that are going on around this space that are causing you to look at it and be like, maybe this is not the right precedent to be setting in this space?
Yeah. Well, there really hasn't been a whole lot yet when it comes to NFTs. I mean, my background is mostly in copyright and trademark law.
So to that note, Miramax and Tarantino, let's maybe shift to that.
Sure. So what I think is most interesting about the Miramax v. Tarantino lawsuit is the incoherence of the complaint, which I think reflects a deeper confusion among people in these content industries about what NFTs are and what their potential is.
Maybe briefly give the context of the case.
Sure. So what happened here was, that Quentin Tarantino obviously wrote and directed the wildly popular film Pulp Fiction, which was distributed, and the copyright was owned by the production company Miramax. So a few months ago, 6 months ago, Quentin Tarantino teamed up with some people to sell a collection of NFTs associated with Pulp Fiction. I think they called them secret Pulp Fiction NFTs. And the idea was that, Quentin Tarantino had ideas for the screenplay that didn't make it into the final movie. And so he was going to sell kind of NFTs of secret content that was related to the choices that he had, like some of the ideas that were not yet public about what he had thought about doing in the movie. And then the purchaser of the NFT would have the choice of either keeping it secret or sharing it with their friends or telling the whole world or whatever, right? So as soon as Miramax heard about that, they, went bananas because, they didn't want Quentin Tarantino to be monetizing this property on his own. Now, the kind of formal legal problem that Miramax had was that Quentin Tarantino had a very unique contract. He was already popular by the time he made Pulp Fiction. He'd negotiated a really kind of personally favorable contract in which he held a right to sell sell copies of the screenplay of Pulp Fiction. And frankly, I mean, I think the easy decision in that case for the court, I'd be very surprised if the court doesn't just look to that contractual provision and say, look, the contract says Quentin Tarantino can sell the screenplay of the film. What he's selling in these NFTs is the screenplay of the film. QED, done, right? He can do that. You can't stop him from doing it. But I think it reflects a deeper issue, right? Which is that people in these content industries think of themselves as entitled to the proceeds from whatever the property is that they own. When Pulp Fiction was made, no one could ever possibly have contemplated the potential existence of something like an NFT market, right? So the contracts did not think about this potentiality at all. And the reality is neither did copyright law, right? Copyright law doesn't have a bucket for NFTs. When you make an NFT, nothing about an NFT implicates copyright law in any way, right? The only copyright implications are in, images or other kinds of copyrighted content that you might associate with the NFT when you're selling it. But the NFT itself doesn't and can't have anything to do with copyright. All it is an entry on the blockchain that's a URL pointing to something. There's no copyrightable implications of that whatsoever, right? So the NFT itself, irrespective of what rights Quentin Tarantino had, he could create NFTs and sell NFTs of anything he wants to. In fact, I myself created a secret Pulp Fiction NFT, which I sold on OpenSea, right? Didn't contain any content. I just called it a secret Pulp Fiction NFT. And that's perfectly fine for me to do. There's nothing copyright infringing about that whatsoever. I have no connection to Pulp Fiction, right? But I can still sell an NFT of Pulp Fiction if I want to. So can Quentin Tarantino, right? And the reality is what Quentin Tarantino is really selling when he sells an NFT in Pulp Fiction is he's selling a right for people to associate themselves with Quentin Tarantino in some way, right? And I think that's what scares Miramax, right? Because Miramax, other production companies, what they realize is that what consumers value, what the market values, is the association with Quentin Tarantino.
Not them.
And not them.
Yeah.
Right. And in particular, in this case, right, a lot of people, and apparently Quentin Tarantino has already sold some of these NFTs for like more than $1 million each. Right. So there's people out there who very strongly value the opportunity to associate themselves in a prestigious way through an NFT with Quentin Tarantino. Now, can Miramax sell its own NFTs of Pulp Fiction? Sure it can. Right? Does anybody on the planet want to buy a Miramax NFT? No, right? That's like saying, I would like to now associate myself with Harvey Weinstein. That's just not going to happen, right? Nobody wants to be associated with Harvey Weinstein. So I think the problem from these production companies' perspective is they're looking at this situation and saying, there's a big pot of money out there. We want that money, but we don't know how to get it. And we specifically don't know how to get it with respect to contracts that we drafted and finalized before the format for claiming this big pot of money even existed.
Are things going to flip where now the influencer or the artist is going to have direct distribution to their audience, and then as part of a smart contract, maybe they just cut in the production company? Is going to reverse? Are we almost there to that point where it's like the production company isn't the one running the tables, but now it's the artist, and the artist just cuts them in because they have the ability to help produce the film?
Well, again, I'm really reluctant to speculate on what the market's going to look like in the future. But I do think that the existence of an NFT market ought to encourage us to think differently about what the market for creative works could look like.
Like music. So Kanye West.
Yeah,
I want to talk
music,
about this point for
like
just a
books,
second.
like whatever.
Kanye West just released this week that he's only going to release his next album on his own platform. He's not going to put it on the streaming platforms, although he might be under contract to do so. In the world of NFTs and where all this is heading, that seems like a perfect avenue for him to do this without getting any legal trouble for it. That am I right there? Can he just create an NFT? Can he get on an NFT platform, release his music? Anybody that buys one has access, and
Sure.
Spotify and Apple are cut out.
Sure. So I'd actually use a different analogy, and this is one that so quite a few years ago, Wu-Tang Clan, right? They released an album as a single copy, which was purchased by Martin Shkreli, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was sort of, the whole thing has been quite a saga. Ultimately, it was actually purchased by a DAO now, and we'll see what happens with the underlying music. But in effect, what they were selling was the music as an NFT. The problem was they got the money, but the music never got released, right? I think this encourages us to think a little bit differently about how we think about the market for works of authorship. Because when it comes down to it, in a digital world, works of authorship are non-rival goods. They're not scarce, right? In theory, the internet means Everyone should be able to consume everything whenever they want, however they want, for free.
I've made this
Right?
argument. I don't think there's scarcity online either.
There's no scarcity,
Yeah.
right? But we create artificial scarcity via copyright because we want to create a medium by which content producers can get compensated for the time, energy, and value that they put into what they produce. Now, is it a great tool for that? No, it's super messy. It's very cost effective. It's very costly. It's very burdensome. It creates all kinds of inefficiencies, right? There's a lot of transactions costs associated with copyright. We stick with it because it's the best tool we've got, right? We need a policy tool to, intervene in innovation policy in order to encourage people to produce things because we really value that kind of cultural production. And the only tool we've had is copyright. So we use copyright because that's what we've got. But we don't like the costs associated with it. One of which is, it makes it expensive to consume things. Another, I think, worse cost is that it reduces the universe of what's available for us to consume, right? Because it means that everything on the long tail just disappears, right? If there isn't a market for it, then it's not worth the trouble for the content owners to make it available, which means it's gone. And that's I think it's a really big problem that I think people don't necessarily always really internalize as much as they should. Well, the wonderful thing, or the potential, I think, of something like an NFT market is that rather than put people in a copyright situation where they have to produce something and then hope to profit from the sale of that thing in the future, right? In the NFT market, they can create the thing and then sell the entire value up front and let the people who buy the NFTs be the speculators who are wondering about the future value of the product, right? And speculation is a really important thing for a market. Like a lot of people complain, NFT market speculation. Speculation is critical for the liquidity of a market. Without speculators, you don't have a market, right? And so I think the great thing is that you can take all of that risk that's associated, or at least some of that risk that's associated with producing works of authorship as to whether or not it can be valuable in the future, and let people who have a larger risk appetite take it on, right? Let the capital markets take on that risk. Let the capital markets buy the goodwill associated with the work, right? And if the work ends up being super duper popular, well, then they'll be able to make money reselling those NFTs in the future to people who are like, I want to be associated with Quentin Tarantino, right? I want to be associated with Kanye West. I want to be associated with the Wu-Tang Clan. The great thing about it is if the artist can sell the work in that way, if they can get the money that they need up front, then they don't have to control the use of the work and it can be available to everyone to use for free. So this actually happened, right? A friend of mine, Simon and Delicate, right? He's indie musicians for a long time, right? He come out with an album that's this kind of crazy Brian Eno meets Weird Al Yankovic type thing almost. It's like the soundtrack for an imaginary amusement park, right? And, he's had real trouble kind of making returns from selling music over the last decade or so. So what I did was I helped him turn this album into an NFT project, which took the form of perpetual admission tickets to the imaginary amusement park, Arcadia Park. And so what he did was he said, I'm going to sell these NFTs of the perpetual admission tickets. And as soon as I sell all 30 tickets, I'm going to put the music itself in the public domain so everyone can hear it, use it, do whatever they want with it. I have now made as much money as I need to make from the project in order for it to have been worthwhile for me. And he sold them in 15 minutes. Right? So in 15 minutes, he was able to make as much money as he'd ever made from an album in the past. And he was able to take the music and put it in the public domain. So it was totally, fully available for anyone to use in any way they wanted to. Now, the question is scalability, but I really like that model, right? The artist gets paid, the public gets what they want, and all the transactions costs are gone. I think that's a beautiful thing, right? I mean, I've got nothing against copyright per se, but I think we can do better, right? And the NFT market at least suggests to me that this is a way of thinking about how we could do better and how we could eliminate some of the inefficiencies associated with
What's the
copyright.
downside to that? So that was a major upside for him to get immediate distribution, get the money up front and to do that. But do labels protect on the downside? So could another artist just take that music, or could somebody just take that music and release it and he can't do anything about it?
Yeah, but he doesn't care. He already get paid.
Yeah, but what if it becomes bigger than what he thought? And then he's like, oh man, I'm leaving a lot of money on the table. Is that the case for a
Sure.
label?
I mean,
I don't know.
yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
is it possible that the artist at the end of the day could potentially make more money if it turned out that something they produced was really valuable? Yes, but the overwhelming majority of what gets released is worth nothing. Right. And so what I would say is don't think about the artist who creates something that turns out to be super duper popular and then they only got, 10% of the predicted future value. Think about the artist who produced something that turned out to be a total flop. They got nothing. Right. And if you're compensating artists up front rather than on the back end, right, that means you're pushing the risk onto the speculators in the capital markets rather than on the artists. Artists are very risk averse, right? Because they tend not to have much in the way of resources, right? They're bad people to be internalizing the risk.
Well, I mean, this is where one of the main features of NFTs, which is the smart contracts that can programmatically deliver royalties to an artist, seems like that kind of solves that problem.
The next project will get
build
smarter
in the right way. And I think we're just scratching the surface of what can actually be done as we build more things like oracles that can execute smart contracts programmatically.
Yeah,
I think that's where the future goes.
I think that's true. I think a lot of people from the art world have talked about that, this idea of like resale royalties and one interesting thing for me from a kind of theoretical perspective is how salient investors are going to find those kinds of built-in royalties. There's a kind of like a lot of theoretical speculation as to how the market will react to that. So I'm selfishly kind of intrigued to see whether or not the speculation plays out and whether or not ultimately buyers in the primary market or perhaps in the secondary market as well see those kinds of royalties as being a disincentive to, at least on the margins, to invest in particular works rather than other ones. I could see it going both ways, and I'm really interested to see which way it plays out in practice.
That sounds like something that the market would almost take care of on its own. It's like if the artist is trying to put too high of royalties in there that gets taken out of the resale fee, then the market's going to balance that out. You're eventually going to see the equilibrium approach there. But anyway, to kind of transition this conversation to kind of the legal field as a whole, you're a professor, you're educating the next generation of legal professionals. Is there enough foresight and education going on around this space? Because things are changing so fast, and we're talking about huge changes to things that protect so much of the entertainment industry and like content in general, which is copyright law. Are our educational institutions providing the right resources and education for the next generation of legal professionals to deal with all the implications of where the space is going?
Yeah, is our law.
Did you say you had 10 years tenure earlier, so you can say whatever you want now?
Yes. Yes. Is our law students learning, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's actually it's a hard question to answer because I think there's a lot of moving parts to it. I can only really speak to legal education because that's what I do. I think in general, legal education is very small c conservative. So we like to put things into familiar boxes and don't know what to do with things that don't fit into familiar boxes. So my observation has been that right now, a lot of legal scholars are kind of struggling to figure out what box to put a lot of these new developments into. Blockchain and Bitcoin have been around long enough that there's, a subset of law professors who've started thinking about them and what they mean in different contexts, like in an internet regulation context and a financial regulation context and so on. I think a lot of other Web3 developments are so new that very, very few law professors have spent much time thinking about it. And I think there's, a similar kind of issue with lawyers, although I will say that, given that lawyers have a financial incentive to learn about and provide useful advice to their clients on this front, I think in some respects, lawyers are actually moving more quickly in some ways than law professors are here. And I think, we'll see a lot of new ideas and information and approaches developed in the next couple coming years. I've had a few conversations with lawyers, and people in different industries seem to see a lot of promise in a lot of different areas, and are trying to figure out how to give good advice to their clients. I look forward to interacting with practicing attorneys and people in different industries and other law professors as well in the near future, to kind of think about how we can help our students sort of find a path in this new area, because I think it's super promising. I can see these companies are growing quickly, and they're definitely looking for legal assistance, and so it's a big growth opportunity for students and new lawyers. And I really hope that we can help give them some of the tools they need to position themselves for those opportunities.
Yeah, and one of the things we were talking about before we started recording here as well was this podcast that you do. And I think that's a genius way to, even if you can't put everything you want into the classroom and into your own curriculum, you've got this podcast that you do. So just as we kind of wrap things up here, would love for you to kind of plug your own podcast, talk about what that podcast is about, and why you chose to start it and why you think it's important.
Yeah. So for going on 4 years now, I've done a podcast called Ipsa Dixit, which is a podcast on legal scholarship. Ipsa Dixit means, sort of a Latin, roughly translates as "because I said so." So it's a little bit of a joke about the nature of legal scholarship and the kind of solipsism of the legal scholarly enterprise. But so basically I record half hour to 45-minute long conversations, usually with legal scholars or people doing scholarly work that's law adjacent in one way or another. Probably done about 750 episodes, something like that. In last year, when I started getting interested in the NFT market and wanted to learn more, I figured I'd integrate that into the podcast. So I started a new series called NFT Notes, where I've been interviewing a range of different people kind of doing different kinds of things within the NFT space. A couple law professors, but mostly, a couple lawyers, mostly people who are artists or curators or investors, people who are kind of engaged in different ways, in part because I wanted to learn more about the space and how people understood what they were doing and sort of what they were doing. I didn't really feel like I fully could wrap my head around sort of what people's business activities were really like and how they perceived what they were doing in a market context. I was also really intrigued by the fact that this is a market that's in its very early stages and seems to be growing and changing very, very quickly. And in my experience, when things like that happen, as markets start to kind of consolidate and reify and develop a kind of more definite form, I think sometimes people have a tendency to forget about the beliefs and expectations and thoughts that they had when the market was still developing. So part of the additional idea was to do a kind of oral history of the development of the NFT market and Web3 space by kind of capturing people's thoughts in the moment about what was taking place and preserving them so that they wouldn't get lost in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about just this conversation compared to some of the other NFT conversations that we've had is I think there's so much to be learned from people who are in the spaces that this technology is going to have ripple effects through. The legal field being a huge one in terms of what you specialize in, which is copyright law. But this has been a conversation that's been just really in depth, and it's got a lot of really good substance. So I'm sure our listeners are really going to appreciate all that. But thank you so much for coming on and doing this. This has been very insightful and, like I said, very in depth. If people want to get a hold of you or learn more or visit your podcast, maybe aside from just searching it, of course, where can they find more information about you?
Sure. Yeah, and real quick, just to give you a shout out, it's so great to have professors like you in the University of Kentucky that come in with these great perspectives, especially in the law space. Because Ian McClure is another one of our friends who is from Kentucky, but came back to Kentucky from an amazing background outside of Kentucky and came back and gave back to the university. And it's just so cool to see the university bringing in people like you that have different perspectives and have different backgrounds that are not just from Kentucky. Mm-hmm. I think that's an amazing thing that university has done, and we're blessed to have people like you in our state, because we need that more to pay people enough to be incentivized to come here and do great things. and share the perspectives. And I think that's just want to give a quick shout out to that, and hopefully we see more of that from the University of Kentucky and Louisville and the state in general. It's great that we can have these conversations.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very flattering. And thank you for all the nice things you've said about the conversation and about what I've had to offer. If people are interested in the podcast, it's Ipsedixit, IPSEDIXIT. It's available on all the places you'd look for podcasts. You can also check out my scholarship if you're interested in legal scholarship. Lots of it. It's all free. It's on my SSRN page. If you say SSRN Brian Frye, it'll come right up. I also write a lot for kind of more popular journals. Recently, I've been writing on NFTs for journal Outland, and also for another one called Right Click Save. I'll probably have some more stuff coming out there soon. So I recommend them. They're really great new publications, kind of digging in deep into the NFT art space in ways that I think are really productive and forward thinking.
Awesome. Well, definitely encourage our listeners to check those out and learn more. But thanks so much. This has been great.
My pleasure.